What I failed to show you earlier, when I did the web argument resolver, or the handler argument resolver, the request context, I had to tell Spring to register a Spring to, hey, I implemented one of these. And how I did that was this add argument resolvers method, and I just made a new request context argument resolver and added it to the list. I'll quickly go over the caching interceptor. So in this case, all I did was in the pre-handle when we were coming in, I checked to see if the resource is cached. And if it is, the contract to the pre-handle method says Spring will assume that the pre-handle will do everything it needs to do with the response. If it says to not continue on. So in the interceptor pre-handle, I can say, yes, continue on down and execute the controller method, or don't. And if not, then I should tweak the response if I need to. And so what I did here was, here's where I added the response status. And then after completion, if it actually, post-handle, if it actually gets to this spot, I actually add, and here my simplistic cache is revealed. I just get the URI in the method. And if it's been hit before, then I cache it. So again, for demo. Is there a round annotation to that one more time? Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, you could have an aspect, right, that wraps controller methods. That would do something very similar. I think some of the, yeah. I don't have a good example of how you could do the same thing with aspects, but likely you could do a very similar thing. Another, just a side note on eTag, if you're interested, I was intrigued to find out that Spring actually gives a out-of-the-box what's called a shallow eTag filter. It's just a servlet web filter. Nothing to do. You don't even have to use the rest of Spring to take advantage. But it is shallow in that. I'll pull it up real quick. So the shallow eTag filter, this one actually processes the request, gets your view that you're going to send back on the response, and then does a hash on it and stores that. And then on a subsequent request, it'll do the same thing, and if it matches, it'll send back the 304. It will not. Won't pass all of the stuff over the wire. So you're not saving the processing time. I think that's what they would mean by deep tagging. They say, oh, we'll talk about deep tagging later, but I couldn't find any reference to it. But their shallow one, at least if you have a really large response, if you're streaming documents or something like that, you can avoid the wire time. Sounds like really easily. So that's pretty cool. All right. Anything else there? Cool. All right, so now I'm going to jump into some of the team stuff again. Like when you're in a larger team, some of the stuff we've done to make sure we're all in the same direction, all in the same line, following the same standards. And that's with integration tests. And this is what Spring allows you to do because of its pulling all your dependencies out into the application context. So early on, I talked about the add controller annotation and how it extends component and how the stereotypes, how they're very useful. And this is where it gets really super useful. If you can make your own custom one, Spring gives you controller, service, repository, and then just a generic component one. You can make your own. If you have your own, specific layer that you want, make your own that extends the component annotation. So Spring will see it as a Spring bean, and you can also, in integration tests, in interceptors, wherever you need to identify that layer of code, you can. So that's what we'll see here. So what I've done is I've got some integration tests. And I've got I did three test methods. One, test no deprecated endpoints. So we made our own annotation. So I'm a new developer on the team, right? And we have our custom annotation that says deprecated endpoints. If I was just a normal Java developer, if I was going to deprecate something, I would use the deprecated endpoint, and that would be like, why would I use something else? So what this does is, if I try to do that, let's bring up my task controller again. Not in the old project. So I'm going to come in here and not knowing any better, throw that in. Stop that so we don't get interrupted. And I'll run this integration test. And I have a couple failures here, so I obviously did not conform to the standard. So I look and it says specifically, oh, I used the wrong deprecation strategy. I have to use deprecated endpoint. So without going to somebody and asking a question, why doesn't this work? What's going on? I've self-learned that I can use a different annotation to do it. Now, if I add that same thing to if I add deprecated to an endpoint that already has a deprecated endpoint annotation, that is more ideal, because then if you're looking through Java doc, you see that it's deprecated and the endpoint is deprecated. And another extension of that is we have an automatic REST documentation tool. And from this deprecated endpoint annotation, we can visually show that, hey, don't call this annotation. We show it in the documentation, but we, scratch it out or color it red or whatever and make sure people don't call it. So I got another test failing, and this one is request mapping at the type level. So request mapping is a really flexible annotation, and you can put it on an entire class so that that path comes to the entire class. And that was something that we weren't interested in. I'm not saying it's a bad practice necessarily, but we weren't interested in. So we actually created an integration test that made sure that you didn't do that. And because that gets confusing, that's where we're out of kind of our sync with design. So when I ran that, then conveniently, it's in a request mapping controller. Now that. As soon as I take that off, go back to JUnit, and we're good to go. So now I know that I've conformed to the team's designs and how everybody wanted to work. And then we'll go over this one in a second. But what I want to highlight in writing tests like these, the reason that I'm giving this talk and we're talking about this in a Spring talk is Spring is what makes this possible. Whether it's the endpoint test or the request mapping, here I'm getting a list of all the beans that are annotated with controller. So here's where if you had your own custom layer and you wanted to get all the classes that were annotated with that and apply some standard to it, you've got your template right here. It's very, very easy. One line, you got a list of all those beans. A side note that got me for a while, when you do get a list of beans, they're wrapped into Spring proxies. And luckily that Spring gives us the AOP utils, which allows you to get to the actual class name. That messed me up for a while. But then I went to Ryan, and that was all good. Next guy, JMX, is another place that Spring helps us out. If you're not familiar with JMX, it stands for Java Management Extensions. It's an easy way to get meta information about your application. And I say meta information just because it runs on a different port. So if you start with Tomcat, you're running a web app on 8080, you have to pick a different port for JMX to run it. It has a different JMX protocol to get the information. And I'll show you that here. It's really useful in a very structured environment. We have we have 4 environments at Thompson, and when you're in the lower ones, developers have more power. When you're in the upper ones, you really want to keep, when you've got 1,000 developers working on a project, you want to keep their hands out of, they're not querying the databases and not fiddling with stuff. So JMX is our solution to that, to make sure everybody's doing it right.